Welcome to the Africa Center. My name is Alana Francis de Govaya, and I'm the Chief Program and Experience Officer. And we're so thrilled to have you here tonight for a very special program that we're doing in partnership with Astra House and Brittle Paper. So we're so excited because this is the second program we opened a new exhibition that is curated by Fitsum Shibeshe, who's an amazing Ethiopian curator, and produced by ICI. So you're here in the first week of this exhibition being open. So I hope you've seen the exhibition if you're here in person, or you'll stay a little bit after the program to see it. And if you're online, that you'll come to the Africa Center to see the exhibition, because it will be open until February 23rd. So what can I say? So basically tonight, this program is at the Africa Center, our mission is really interdisciplinary. And this program tonight is really exciting because it's really bringing narrative and art together. It's called Becoming Art and Narrative. And we have an amazing opportunity because Vanessa A, congratulations. She just came out with a new book called Homebound that came out last week. Give it up for Vanessa. And what's really beautiful, and the reason why we decided to really center tonight's program on Vanessa's book, is because it really ties to the theme of the exhibition about belonging, identity, movement, which is a really important focus of the Africa Center, the movement of people of African descent, not only from Africa to America, but from Africa to around the world. And from around the world back to Africa, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about as well tonight. So, please remember that after the program, if you're here in person, you can buy Vanessa's book. If you're online, please also buy Vanessa's book, support her. We're so proud to have Sisters Uptown, which I just found out tonight is the only Black-owned bookstore in Manhattan. Corey, who works for Sisters, 2022, Corey, who works for Sisters Uptown, was telling me she made the sign 6 years ago, and that hasn't changed. So please support Sisters Uptown and buy Vanessa's book through them. So without further ado, I will introduce Yolanda Sangweni, who is a dear friend of the Africa Center. Yolanda's been with us since we opened our doors in January of 2019. She's the VP of Programming at NPR, Programming and New Content Development. Sorry, I forgot about that.
I don't know if this is on.
This is on. So I'd like to welcome Yolanda, who's going to be moderating tonight's conversation. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And I'll hand it over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you. Sister Veep, that's what you should call me. I'm kidding. Welcome, everyone. I am Yolanda, as Alana so graciously introduced me. And tonight, we really are here to celebrate Vanessa's debut memoir, Homebound. I'm just going to read you a little bit about what the memoir is about, and then I'll welcome our panelists. So in Homebound, Vanessa explores the ways we define home and belonging, from her birth in Cameroon to her adoption by her aunt and her aunt's white French husband, to experiencing housing insecurity in Europe and her eventual immigration to the US. After her parents' divorce, Vanessa traveled with her mother to Lyon and later to London, eventually settling in Reno, Nevada. We have a lot of questions about that. From Lyon to London and then Reno, Nevada. Okay. So at 20, still practicing as an evangelical Christian and newly married, Vanessa applied to and was accepted by Harvard Law School, where she was one of the youngest members in her class. In this book, really, Vanessa excavates her experience being a child of the diaspora, having been born in Cameroon, moving to France, moving to London, and then moving to the US. So there are a lot of ways that many of us in this room, I imagine, will find similarity to our lives. So before I even introduce our panelists, I would love for you to sit with this question, and maybe we can open up it towards the end of our panel. What is home? How do you describe home? So, would love to welcome Vanessa A. Vanessa, do you want to come up? And then I'll just read your bio. Vanessa is a consumer protection lawyer and essayist. As mentioned, she was born in Cameroon and has grown up in England, the US, and in France. She holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Nevada and a law degree from Harvard. This is her first memoir, but you have written extensively about your experience and overall. So by the way, Vanessa has multiple jobs. She's a consumer protection lawyer and she's a prolific essayist. So welcome Vanessa A, B, everyone. Next, I'd like to welcome our next panelist, Miatta Kawinzi, who is a Kenyan Liberian American multidisciplinary artist, writer, and educator. She was raised in Tennessee and Kentucky and based in Brooklyn. Her work explores hybridity with the African diaspora and the reimagining of the self, identity, and culture through abstraction and poetics. She received an MFA in studio art from Hunter College and a BA in interdisciplinary art and cultural theory from Hampshire College. Her pieces, She Gather Me and how do I say that? Afro-America? Afro-America. You can see both her pieces here in the States of Becoming exhibition. So welcome, Miatta. Our next panelist is Hannah Giorgis. Hannah is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers culture. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, New Yorker, BuzzFeed, The Guardian, Pitchfork, The Fader, and The Lifted Brow, among others. Her short story, A Double-Edged Inheritance, was shortlisted for the 2022 Akko Kane Prize. Welcome, Hannah. My sisters are very accomplished, very accomplished. I'm just going to begin by asking Vanessa, to read us an excerpt for the book, and we will begin with our series of questions. So, well, Vanessa?
I hand my American driver's license to the black guard in the window of the French consulate in Washington, D.C. When he calls me Madame, his accent resembles mine, the impeccable French of double diaspora children seated in the tropics, grown in European schools, and rescattered in lands more fertile with opportunity. I wonder if his accent changes when he speaks to his mother, the way mine does. I show him proof of my appointment for today, December 4th, 2017, passport replacement. He looks at the license and at my face again. He asks, "Where are you from?" I answer him, "Poitou-Charentes." The answer I have given him is a compromise, a reflection of what I do each time my origins are in question. Reach for the layer that feels most relevant or representative of me in the moment. But where in time is home measured? By which parents or neighbors is it defined? By what flaws or virtues? I condense my answer. I say France or briefly England, depending on who's asking and why. I might tell them that I am from the United States, though this feels dishonest. Even after 20 years on this continent, I struggle to fully claim either Nevada or Washington, D.C. But don't we all do this? Don't you? Home to me feels as cumulative as a nesting doll. Home is a shell painted with the present, the city where I live and work, the neighborhood where I feel the streets belong to me as much as they do my neighbors, the apartment where I rest my head at night. It is the soil my grandparents tilled to provide for my parents, for me. It is the church body that once shaped my ethics and the beliefs that filled the void when the church could no longer supply answers. But home is also the innermost layer, the envelope in which I navigate the world, my body and skin, my gender and sexual orientation, the names that follow me. Between these layers are iterations of myself. None of them static, though they are fixed in the moment that I remember them. For those who grew up in a single house, in a single gender or orientation, to a single set of parents, the nesting doll may be sparse in layers. For others, it is packed as densely as mine. But the layers are always there, projecting themselves onto the present and future, informing what we can and cannot call home. Where we are from, where we get to be from, seems inextricable from not only our personal histories, but also the histories of certain people and spaces. In that way, home is a function of what each of us is entitled to and why, tethered to the economic and political forces that shape our lives, forces that include or exclude, give or take away, all the while, often, maintaining the illusion of complete autonomy. I am reminded here of the first tale many of us are ever read about home, the one that goes like this. 3 little pigs leave the familial nest to build their own. Driven by laziness, one brother builds his abode out of hay. The second, slightly less lazy, out of sticks. Only the third has the foresight to erect one out of brick. When a wolf threatens to eat the little pigs, the flimsy houses fall, sending the first two brothers to the brick house. This last one stands and rescues all three. I was too young then to question the implication that good things come to those who work hard, or that home is a reflection of character, and that those who like it deserve less. Rather, I processed the little pigs' homes through the lens of the narrator, facades reduced to personal choice. But home doesn't exist in a political and historical vacuum. The location and quality of our housing, the safety of our streets, and their proximity to amenities or economic opportunity are products of policy decisions made above our heads by government bureaucrats, corporate executives, and outspoken neighbors. So is the extent to which natural disasters, global pandemics, and financial crises consistently hit some populations harder than others. Nor can context be divorced from the bodies that we call home, given how much outside perceptions of their worth affect our ability to care for ourselves, to obtain medical support and economic protection, our right to live without fear of sexual violence and without fear of the carceral arm of the state. Our sense of home is thus necessarily tangled with that of others. For some, deciphering its meaning, its boundaries, and its relation to the rest of the world is a matter of survival. But this should not leave us hopeless. As my friend Pete Davis wrote in his book dedicated, our roots can lie in the future, binding us and our descendants together in a shared destination, be it a goal or a land. I find it helpful to remind myself that for all its layers and complexity, home possesses a certain universality. Our nesting dolls are built from the same DNA blocks and carbon atoms. As we close our eyes and think home, I suspect that we all feel something, that our minds entertain similar questions in seeking to define it. It's the confidence in this universality that emboldens us to ask complete strangers where they are from. We pry, certain that we will recognize elements of ourselves in the stranger's answer, no matter the distance between our places of birth and present circumstances. I'd like to think the best of these encounters sharpen our own appreciation of home. This book is my long answer to the question of where I am from. In pursuit of thoroughness, it is also an excavation of my most intimate layers, from my name and body to the places that shaped me, home that I passed through and broke away from, the homes that were threatened, that were reclaimed, or that will someday be lost. I want to tell you about the homes that I made mine and about the ones that made me. As novelist Kazuo Ishiguro wrote, in the end, stories are about one person saying to another, "This is the way it feels to me. Does it also feel this way to you?" And so I share these stories and interpretations as half of a conversation between us, a test, perhaps, of this universality's boundaries. I hope there is merit in ever turbulent times in continuing to examine what home is to us and what we dream it to be. These stories are thus also an inquiry. This is the way home feels to me. Does it also feel this way to you?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I think I would love to begin by just talking about your process of writing a memoir. We've heard memoirs described as so many things, a chance to look back at what has happened and, examine your life. Can you walk us through what made you get to this place of I'm going to write a memoir?
There were a few catalysts, but so I live in Washington, D.C., and I got the idea for this book in 2018, about 2 years into the Trump administration. And after having lived in so many places, I felt so at home in D.C. and finally rooted and settled. But D.C. is a strange place. When people win elections, they come in with their people. Literally in January 2017, I was just minding my business at the gym, and Rick Perry was trying to get a gym card. It's just they are everywhere. And it really made me think of, okay, I guess these external forces can change my relationship to this place and what does it mean to me and what do I even think home is. So that was a big part of me writing the book. I will say also, and maybe the millennials on this stage will relate to this, but you know, every generation has, will have like the media declare like the voice of a generation. So for me, that was a lot of different people, including Lena Dunham, who is a very talented person, but I was just like, what? Like, I cannot see myself in this person's experience at all. And somehow she has been declared the voice of my generation. And I felt like, no, I'm going to write us into the story. So that was, a part of writing this memoir for me.
I'm curious why DC felt you were comfortable in DC, of all the cities that you've lived.
It was kind of accidental. After law school, it's the city that gave me my first job. And so I was like, I will happily move down there and start making student loan payments. But I was surprised once I found the community. It's an incredibly ethnically diverse place, politically diverse. People there come from all over the country. And so you end up with these adults who are very open to making new friends. And I have found it to be a very special place.
Got it. I think I want to just read this line that really stood out to me that Vanessa wrote. She wrote, growing up, I used to envy my classmates for having the option to explain where they were from in one breath without caveats or asides. That stood out to me because I think many of us here we don't tell a linear story. When someone says, where are you from? It can be very similar to what Vanessa described, which is like, what am I going to tell them? How do I get out of this quickly? And how invested is this person in my answer, right? So I would love to hear from you, Miatta and Hannah. How do you answer the question, where are you from? Because you've lived so many different experiences within your life.
For sure, and what an honor to be here with you all, and then the Africa Center with ICI in the show and celebrating Homebound. So just gotta say that. But yeah, I love how you also said, it kind of depends on how invested they seem in the answer, because it always depends for me how I answer that question, where I am, my relationship to the person asking. Where I think they might be from or where they're from, because I grew up in Kentucky and in Tennessee and, have lived in different parts of the world. My family is from West Africa and East Africa, Liberia and Kenya. I've been in New York for 13 years. And so there are a lot of different places that feel like home. In some ways it's like that plurality can be very, it's a blessing, to have multiple homes. And then it's also this question of, the displacement that can also be part of having multiple homes, where I'm always missing somewhere or someone. So it definitely depends.
Can you give us a short answer? Where are you from?
See, well, because we're we're in this conversation, so I don't know. Also, for me, it's important to represent the South too, because I feel like in New York, the South doesn't always get the shine that it should get. So I'm both Southern and African diasporic and a Brooklynite.
That's good. I feel like I should start with the short one because I'm going to forget if I don't do it now. Mine, I think the version that my editors would agree is probably the most succinct, is that I was born and mostly raised in Southern California with some brief but formative stints in Washington, D.C. and Ethiopia, and I now live in Brooklyn. That's what the editor. But the answer always changes for me too. It changes in terms of whether it feels like the person is invested, whether they care, whether they're trying to decide if I'm someone worth talking to, in any number of ways. sometimes I can tell somebody's trying to figure out what the asterisk is looking at me, right? Like, you're Black, obviously, but like, what's going on there? And sometimes when I feel people doing that, I'll sort of resist it, depending on who it is, and kind of play around and really get into Southern California stuff, even though I'm not particularly attached to it. But it just, I think as I've grown, and especially in my 20s and coming into my 30s now, I've thought a lot about what gets flattened when I default to Ethiopia as an answer, and finding out more about my family and our histories and the country's histories in the region specifically, and wanting a clearer answer there. Because I think it's always hard for me to say I am from Ethiopia. I was born here. I was born in California. But I always say that my family is from Ethiopia, and that feels the most inclusive and true, and it feels like it grounds my home in them rather than in the space being a static thing.
Wonderful. So in the book, if you have not read it, Vanessa does document, even though you were raised in France, you kept a very strong bond with your family back home in Cameroon. I'm just curious how, because sometimes when you are a child and you're removed from your home country, it can be difficult to maintain the bonds with the family back home. So how, if you can share, because I think you do it in the book very well, how were you able to continue to cultivate that relationship with home?
Well, I was very fortunate as an adoptee because I was adopted by my biological aunt. And so I, didn't have to really do the work of figuring out, big picture where my family was from. I was adopted by my biological mom's sister. So I always knew that maternal line of the family. We didn't have enough money to go back often. So I think that sort of created a wedge. I felt both Cameroonian, but also when I went to Cameroon as a child, I was immediately clocked as a foreigner. And, I've gone back twice as an adult, and the same thing happens. Like, people can just spot me. They do, which is interesting, right? Because you think, okay, a Black face in a sea of Black faces, but the place where you live seeps into you in these various ways. So I think it's apparent from the way I walk and the way I carry myself, and then obviously my accent the moment I open my mouth.
My chair is full. I'm sorry. Thank you. I wanted to ask the same question of you, Hannah. You mentioned that your family is from Ethiopia, and I just wondered whether you have yearned for a tighter relationship with Ethiopia, or were you always going? And can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I went not terribly often also as a child because we didn't have the money. I mean, flying 6 people to Ethiopia semi-regularly is just wildly expensive. But when we went, we stayed for long periods of time. And I always remember the feeling that I always wanted in the years kind of intervening between those trips was the feeling that I had toward the end, right? Like the connection the rootedness that I felt then, when my Amharic was better, when it was more practiced, when it was more lived in, when it felt less stuffy, like my grandmother's Amharic, which is kind of still what I speak. And that's certainly been a thing that I've yearned for. I've wanted to have also a simpler relationship to it. It's a country and kind of region that's had a lot of conflict, a lot of turmoil, a lot of even historical events that as I get older and as I learn more about the specific place, I struggle with. And I struggle to feel sort of the same romanticized closeness that I wanted maybe as a high schooler or even, at like 21.
Miatta, you often in Miatta's a multidisciplinary artist. As I mentioned, Miatta's work is here at this exhibition. And in interviews, Miatta often talks about moving between multiple geographic, cultural, and linguistic places. The work of adapting and being malleable as an immigrant is often, wherever you land, you kind of have to do the work of being or finding some way to access the culture that of the host country or host space that you're in. And can you tell us more about navigating between these cultures in a way? And I wanted to sort of relate it back to Hannah too, who, when many of us, you are here, you speak English outside, but at home you're speaking Amharic, you're speaking, I imagine, what are you speaking, Swahili?
In English at home.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Vanessa, what were you speaking at home? French, got it. So, but if you can tell us just, Miatta, just navigating that sort of different cultural spaces that you've had to move in and how that reflects in the art that you make now.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. And I'm also kind of thinking about something that Hannah just said about this, I don't know, bringing up the idea of romanticizing, because that's something that, I don't know, I think being in the diaspora, from speaking for myself, in the past, it's been easy for me to kind of like romanticize, you know, this sort of removed homeland where I would just be settled and everything would cohere magically when in fact, you know, also like Liberia, where my maternal lineage is from, I've never been there. I'm planning my first trip for next year, but as I was growing up, there were like a series of civil wars and my family was trying to come here. So it wasn't really on the table to go there. And so I don't know, I'm always like thinking about how to sort of acknowledge the nuance of, you know, of within diaspora and within questions of homeland and home. And yeah, it's even the language question, because like when I was growing up, my father, and I had like Kenyan family in Nashville when we lived there, they would speak Swahili, but I didn't really learn it very well because it was like, okay, you got to go be the best, like in these classes at those schools in English, you know? And so I think that's something too, where, you know, I don't know, like the immigrant experience and sort of notions of achievement that come up there, right? And what can be lost within that. You know, like I have been trying to learn more Swahili, for instance. And also around language, like in Liberia, my mom would speak a patois of English, Liberian patois. And so we would speak that in the home sometimes, but I'm really interested too in how, I don't know, especially Black folks, how we remix language, how we rip off of, you know, language, even like different within West Africa, like how French is different than if you're in Paris, right? And so like in traveling and in negotiating different spaces, as you brought up, that's something I'm always interested in. And I feel like that's a place to find like agency and freedom. So yeah.
Thank you. Vanessa, in the book, Vanessa describes, each chapter begins with a different definition of what home is. And I'd love to just read a few of the definitions that she writes. So home is one's place of residence, a house. Home is a father. Home is a safe space, a body, a homeland. And I love that Vanessa illustrates that home can be many things. It is a multitude of experiences. It is layered. And you write that home is as cumulative as a nesting doll. And I would love this passage where he says, for those who grew up in a single house, in a single gender or orientation, to a single set of parents, the nesting doll may be sparse in layers. For others, it is packed as densely as mine. And if anyone doesn't know the nesting doll, can you just give us the nesting doll? Because I had to look it up because I didn't know what a nesting doll was. But can you tell us? Like
those little Russian dolls where you open it and there's another tiny doll in there and another tiny one inside of it.
Got it. I think for me, the nesting doll metaphor, it has always been burdensome to have all these cultures living within me. I also have yearned to just be, can I just be from Brooklyn? And I was born and raised in Brooklyn. Just leave it at that. Tell me how you have not let it be burdensome to you.
I mean, it was burdensome, I think, when I was a younger person, definitely as a child, and maybe up to my early 20s. I think just because I didn't appreciate necessarily all the richness that came with like kind of unusual childhood and an unusual path to get to America. And I had to eventually I grew up and realized that actually those experiences were rich and they have helped me connect with people of very different backgrounds. I think easier than if I didn't have such like complex nesting doll. But I think a lot of that came with time and growing up and also like as an adult reaching a place where I felt more in control of where I got to live. At some point I stopped following my mom and really settled down and picked Washington, D.C. and was like, okay, I'm now never moving. And having that stability allowed me to then reflect back and being like, yes, that was difficult, but also it was kind of beautiful and made me who I am.
Wonderful. So as I mentioned, Hannah has also written a short story that was shortlisted for the, do we say ACO?
AKO.
Oh, AKO.
Corrected as a bunch.
Kane Prize. The short story is called A Double-Edged Inheritance. And I think for me, what stood out in that short story is a moment when one of the characters is searching for home through a cloth, a traditional Ethiopian cloth called gabi. And so I would love to excavate the idea of like finding home through clothing, searching for home in music, in food, in smells. Can you tell us more about why you chose that particular experience for that character?
Yeah, I think a lot about home as a sensory experience or the sensory experiences that evoke home. And in that story, it made sense for it to be a gabi because it's both tactile, right? Like it's a very specific feeling when it's on the body. It's a very specific kind of comfort that you feel sort of enveloped in one. It was partly that, and then partly the sort of olfactory part of it, right? Like I can smell gabis I've had here since 2005 maybe, and it still feels like if you smell it long enough, there's some Ethiopia in there, right? It never quite leaves, and especially when you first bring it back, even if you wash it, you do all the things you do, and it still retains that. So for me, that's always been really, really grounding in the States. And in the context of that story, which takes place in a market district in Addis Ababa, I needed a reason for her to be in the market, and I needed a thing for her to be finding, right? And one of the many things that just historically as a kid that I would growing up that I would go there and get was a gabi with my mom, with my aunt, and so it felt like a thing to reach toward that had both of those elements. There's a little bit of other things in there, right? There's some music, there's language, there's food, and I think food as a grounding. Food as a connection to home is particularly hard for me here as opposed to DC, where there's an Ethiopian restaurant on every block, it feels like. But it's in that there's a particular comfort that I found in the tactile and in the olfactory part of that.
Absolutely. I want to pivot a little bit because what Vanessa does in this book is talk a lot about her relationship with her fathers, right? You dedicate the book to your mothers because you will learn when you read the book that there were many women that raised Vanessa, but also you document very complicated relationships with the men, the biological father, the stepfather, a priest who was meant to be your mother's spiritual father who sort of crosses the line. And I'm just curious, even when it came down, you kept your father's name, your biological father's name. Why did you choose to keep it when you had an option not to? Tell me why did you choose to keep his name despite the complicated relationship that you have with him?
Setting aside how complicated it is to do a name change through the French government, the fact that I do not like paperwork, I think, I really wrestled with it for a long time. I didn't, you'll find out in the book, I didn't know my biological father. I met him once when I was 3 years old, but I knew of him because he, knew my family members and he was a very ambitious person. So I had a sense of who he was as a person, and I actually didn't quite like what I heard. And yet this person's last name was on everything. It was on my my file at the pediatrician, and it was on my high school diploma and then my law school diploma. And I just really hated the fact that this person was getting, in some ways, credit for my accomplishments without having put in the work of being there for me. At the same time, you know, his last name has a particular translation in his language, and it is Cameroonian, and I like that it is Cameroonian as a Black person. That feels grounding to me. And so I really had to think about what I wanted to do with that. And ultimately, it's a name that I chose not to pass down to my son, but I'm comfortable holding on to it. At the same time, I did make the choice to start, once I started writing, I kind of bifurcated my identities. And so I was like, in the real world, I am Vanessa A, and I think I'm comfortable with that now. But I kind of don't want this person to keep getting credit for my work. So I wrote the book, and all of the essays that I've published out in various places under this very lazy pseudonym, AB, which you can immediately tie back to my real name. But that was the choice behind that.
I do love what you write about the choice to keep the name. You write, "My name is a people and a place. And if I am to never feel completely at home in it, then I must make a new home of it. Rewrite it with a pseudonym, but also in a way that I live my life, that I treat my people, that I honor my values." And that's why you chose AB rather than Asebele for the authorship.
Yes, that's right.
I love it. Can you, Miatta and Hannah, you know, I've read also, Miatta in particular, you've called language a dwelling place. She's so deep. I was like, a dwelling place. I love it. And Hannah, you also, I love that you still speak, you know, we talked briefly about Amharic, and I want to also revert back to the idea of home and how language allows you to dwell in home, whether it is, you know, the longing for the patois of the ways that your family mixes other different languages. Can you tell me more about like that excavation and how that keeps you connected back?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you. And also, it connects to when I was reading Homebound. Yeah, there is, and what you just said about kind of like choice. Because I don't know, I spent a lot of time just feeling very melancholy and about this question of home, and very disenfranchised and displaced. And more recently, I've been thinking about this idea of having multiple homes as like this richness, this place of generation, of possibility. And for me, this question also connects back to my art practice, because often the work starts with writing, starts with language. The two videos that I have in this show are very much, they are sprouted from and contain text that's kind of broken up and spread out. And in a very sort of concrete way, as I've moved around and experienced displacement, the act of writing and speaking has provided a sense of shelter, a sense of grounding for me. And, you know, it was so emotional for me to read the book, because a lot of it, you know, resonated. And also there was this thing that you said about, because I also experienced housing insecurity growing up and as an adult. And when you were kind of talking about like for poor folks, like sometimes it feels like life just happens to you, you know, that you're at the mercy of these external forces. And that's something that really kind of, it just kind of struck me, because, you know, also being Black in America, for instance, or in the world, you know, feeling like these external forces just have such control in ways over you. But like, how do we find those places and spaces where we can sort of forge a sense of freedom, of agency? And that's like always at the top of my mind. And for me, like writing language has provided that space to open.
And Hannah, so much of your practice is about language and exploring, navigating, you know, telling so much, documenting so much of culture through language. How do you approach that practice, knowing who you are, your lived experience. How do you approach that practice?
I try to think a lot, especially recently, about what a tremendous privilege it is to speak Amharic, right? To be able to be in community with people who speak it, to speak with my parents, yes, but to be able to speak with people when I go back home, when I'm having conversations, when I'm in a cab and somebody hears me talk and says, like, how long has it been since you left, and not where are you from, right? There are all these ways that it's like quite literally grounding me in that space, and I don't take that lightly at all. And I think as I've grown older, I've realized that because of just the geopolitical ramifications of everything happening in the region, it's not an accident that of the 3 languages that my parents' various people speak, the only one I know is Amharic, right? Like that feels pretty like a direct result of what has happened there, and what is continuing to happen there in some ways. And as I've gotten older, I've spoken with so many people who speak Ethiopian languages or Eritrean languages that are not Amharic or that are not Tigrinya. And in learning from those people and learning from their traditions, their writing traditions, their oral traditions, I've been able to really learn and expand my view of what it means to be Black, to be Ethiopian, to be African. And I think a lot about just how grateful I am for that. But in practice, I've thought a lot since writing that short story about the fact that I don't write in Amharic, and I only recently retaught myself how to read. It's an entirely different alphabet, and in relearning to read, I realized that I'm misspelling things because I'm mispronouncing them when I say them, and so that's been a very humbling experience. But it helps me remember that all of this is sort of a lifelong learning process and not a thing that I broadcast and write and kind of put out into the world and stop doing, which is hard as a person whose stuff is public, right? Like there are things that I wrote or thought about language in 2014 and 2015 that I feel very differently about now. And some of what's hard about writing in a public sphere is that you don't necessarily get to go back and like add an addendum that's like, hey, I've actually learned about the root of this. So trying to keep learning and being gracious with myself is sort of at the center of what I'm working through, at least right now in the work.
Thank you. So I would love to open this up to questions, and I'm want to help you think about them while I ask this last question. We are here also celebrating Vanessa's book, but also this is an exhibition called States of Becoming. As you mentioned, see the exhibition in the other room, but the exhibition really contemplates our relationship as people of the African diaspora and our relationships with the places and the environments that we currently occupy. And I would love to ask each of you on this panel, Vanessa, you write about having lived in America for over 20 years, and it's still difficult for you to claim this place. So are any of you on this panel, interested in becoming and in, claiming this place where we are now?
Well, I feel very Americanized. So in some ways, I think America has shaped me, whether I wanted it or not. It's so ingrained in me. But I don't know, again, back to Washington, D.C. being such a special place, it has these really deep roots. It has communities, Black American communities, Ethiopian communities that have been there for a very long time. And so it feels hard for me as a person who moved in like 2012 to really feel like I'll ever be able to say I'm from Washington, D.C. That said, I think there is great privilege with feeling like a guest. I don't take the place for granted. I feel like I want, if I ever leave it, I'd like to leave it better than when I came in, just as I would at a friend's house. And so in that way, I still feel a little bit like an outsider, even at home, but I'm comfortable with that. And I hope that I can just be a good steward of the city that has made me feel so welcome.
Sounds like we're going down the line. You can go. I'm not particularly interested in claiming it. I know that my life has been shaped by what I am afforded and the access I have had to certain institutions and forms of mobility that are a direct result of my nuclear family being here, right? That like other parts of my family don't have access to. It doesn't, I know that carrying a US passport has specific implications and value, and I'm not making light of any of that, but to move around outside of the US, I'm not quick to like, you know, raise an American flag or like, it's not, no. But there is, when I'm traveling elsewhere and people ask where I'm from, I just default to New York, and that feels right. That feels good. And in part because this is the only place where I've built a home that is of my own making, that I really, and that has parts of all of the places I've been that matter to me, and is also the first place my mom lived when she came to the US. So that sort of hyper-local, hyper-specific claim or willingness to consider myself part of something only feels right in that context. But for the US, I'm just well aware of all of the different ways that me and the people I care most about don't fit into what this country sees itself as. And so that's okay, have it.
Yeah, and I think for me, like a lot of what Vanessa and Hannah, you said resonate with me. And also, this New York is like the place that I like moved myself, like decided to live, have lived in a long time, have put down a lot of roots and built a lot of relationships, and other people are also home. The trees that I go visit in Prospect Park all the time are home. You know, the Jamaican spots around where I live are home. So this is home. It's very much home, and it's also not the only home. But I think for me, the legacy of Black America in particular is something that I am part of and that I like want to claim because, you know, I don't know, I'm like, yes, there are like these projections of the US, but like thinking about forms that originated here, jazz, you know, like the blues, those sorts of traditions, I feel like are very, like I see myself in that lineage as well. And also as diasporic. So I don't know, it always goes back to multiplicity for me. And like what you said about sort of this ongoing process, like for me, that's, you know, life, that's my art practice. It's like I'm trying to continue to build connections back to these homes in Kenya and Liberia, as well as continue to cultivate the home in New York and in the States and just hold it all together.
So I would love to invite any questions that you have for Vanessa or Hannah or Miatta as well. But as you think of those questions, I really also invite you to participate in this incredible memoir and the central question of what is home. And I would love to open up the space for you to tell us what is home.
We're going to stay here as long as it takes. So
home is under my hand-spun cotton strip woven cloth from northern Burkina Faso. The softest cloth I've ever touched.
Home for me right now is just being in this space and hearing these stories. Like, I feel like this has been like in my mind, like you guys are acting out what's always in my mind, what I experience day to day. So just thank you for this.
One of the things that resonated with me, and I might not be relaying it the way it was said, was this constant pulling and not really feeling where your true home is, right? I was born in the Bahamas. My mom is from Jamaica, so I lived in Jamaica for a while. And then I came here. So where is home? Because back home, I have my family in Jamaica. I have my family, my dad's family in the Bahamas, but my children, my husband are here. And I don't really fit into what this home is that America defines. So there's this constant struggle trying to find, where do I fit in? So where do I find my home in the places where the people that I love are. And for me, that's home. Going home to my kid who's rambunctious, my husband who sounds like he's fresh off the boat, even though he's been here like 25 years. So that's where I'm centered, not so much in a location, but in all of the culture and beauty that we all bring together. So that's home for me.
I think something that resonates with me is the idea of home in the food and the music and the language or the dialect, because no matter where you go, those things carry with you in some way, shape, or form. There is some kind of food tradition or some, word. You may not know the whole language, but there are some words that that have that connection to, quote unquote, back home that always carry along with you.
Home is fluid.
First, Vanessa, thanks for writing this book. I also really appreciated Miatta's point about places where you think of as home, where people are actually trying to leave. You mentioned Liberia. I'm from Sierra Leone, and at the age of 5, I was a refugee in another African continent. I always see Sierra Leone as a place that I'm trying to leave to go somewhere else. And even though it's my home and I've lived there for most parts of my life, I see other places as places of refuge instead of Sierra Leone. And I was just wondering how you guys, see that relationship of, yes, you are diaspora and you live in the US, but then places where the diaspora might think of as, yes, my family's from Eritrea or Ethiopia or Liberia, but I live in the US now. How do you kind of look at that complication as, I live here, I think of my original home as that place, but it's also a place where people are like leaving or don't see as a place of refuge?
I mean, I mostly feel a lot of guilt, like it's not lost on me just how much, and I've tried to emphasize that in the book, like the amount of luck it just takes to end up with an EU passport and a US passport, which is just opens up it's like a door to the world. And I thought about writing about what you're describing in the book, I thought about writing in the book about what you're describing, which is the strange, there's a part in the book where towards the end where I take a trip back to Cameroon because I want to reconnect and I want to find my roots. And I'm going back to this place knowing that there are Cameroonians being held by ICE in Texas. It's making the news. It's in The Intercept. Like my family, they just got unlucky. I have family members who would pay exorbitant amounts of money if it could get them out of Cameroon. And it feels, in some ways I felt almost, I still stand behind taking the trip back and it was important to me. But there's a part of it that's like a little like frivolous, like here you are going for fun to like go find your roots when like people are trying to leave with very good reason. And I don't quite know how to balance that other than to feel very badly and to not take anything I have for granted.
Yeah, it's a constant tension for me too. I think as a person, that the work as I've gotten older has been just not doing that romanticizing, right? Like not having not having public romanticizations that don't account for that. And I've definitely been guilty of that absolutely in the past. And I think as a writer, it's what I try to do is be mindful of the moments when it makes sense for me to be speaking about something and the moments when it doesn't, and when I'm not equipped and when I'm not the person to be telling a story. But capable of handing off a mic to somebody who should be, and trying to always do that. But it's hard. The access in the US comes with a kind of flattening that means I'm often asked to speak about things that I don't feel like I'm a representative of, and I don't feel like ethically I should. So navigating that in terms of the work can be really difficult, but does feel really important.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to say, well, thank you for that question. And you know, it is an ongoing sort of tension for me too. And like I said before, I'm only going to Liberia for the first time next year. And so even, you know, I don't know, there's a way in which it's so abstract still for me because, you know, the food, the people, my family have been here with me, but I've never actually been on the soil. So, and acknowledging, yeah, like that, the privilege of the Blue American passport and citizenship, and also, yeah, these sort of the ongoing inequalities in these home countries and also in this place. And I think about how privilege is also, it's a spectrum where, you know, I don't know, I remember when like the Black Lives Matter uprisings were popping off in 2020, and I was talking to my friend back from South Africa who was like, they were basically like, oh, but you know, you wouldn't just get killed for being Black here. And not to sort of flatten, but just, you know, some of the stuff that is the reality of being in the US is also different. And so just holding space for all of that. And for me, just thinking about how I can build up resources so that I'm able to like contribute in material ways eventually as well. And as an educator, that I'm able to contribute in that sense as well. So that it feels more like an exchange, not like a sort of one-sided engagement. Yeah.
I'll say talking with my parents about that a little bit more has helped because my dad in particular has a pretty contentious relationship to where he's from back home. And he speaks a lot more eloquently and with a lot more nuance than I ever could about what it's like to still have, to still feel that as his roots, as his home place, as a place where he's grounded, and yet to have it be somewhere that for so long he wasn't safe.
I know you wanted to say something. I don't know where the mic went.
I guess I was going to answer the question about what is home. And I think over time it's become, home is the place where I feel like I can be most myself. And that definition feels more real to now when I think about all of the places that I've called home, because I haven't had just one central sort of nuclear family, mother passing away, my parents divorcing, being raised by grandparents, but then being raised also in the household of many aunts, you know, and uncles in different geographies. And so I think sort of a very Southern saying when people say like, where are you from? It's like, I say, I'm from Washington. I'm from Long Island by way of Washington, DC. I was born in Washington. For the longest time, I identified as a Washingtonian, and that was it. Like, even though I spent most of my life on Long Island, I could tell you how to get to like 5 places on Long Island. I never accepted that was where I lived and where I had all these formative time, because most of the family where I felt most comfortable, and I didn't realize how uncomfortable Long Island was for me during that time. It was until I got older and it was like, oh, that's why that never felt like home for me. Not because I wasn't with loved ones, but Long Island as a geography was really off-putting in a way that DC was completely home, right? And then at some point, I realized like DC wasn't home anymore. And Harlem became home, right? And the way that I accept that and the way that I feel that in my bones, you know, and the way that I feel like I've bought a house someplace. And the first time after owning it for 5 years, I walked in it and was like, oh, I'm home. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm calling this, what? Wait, this is just a house that I own at a place. And now this is also home. And so I think, you know, just thinking about the title of this exhibition about becoming, right? Like there are ways in which even how we're thinking about home shifts and changes. And and we can find it in people, and we do have those. I absolutely have sensory experiences about that, and need that now when I travel, right? Like I travel with certain incense or certain candles when I go into hotel rooms, because I'm like, actually, I just need to immediately feel like this is where I'm going to be for this period of time, and it needs to not feel foreign to me. And so what does that look like in the rest of my life as well? You know, as you're meeting people, like who feels like home, you know, and not just the spaces that give you shelter, but the people and the care and the conversations, frankly, that you operate in that feel sort of more rooted and grounded in who you want to be, and who you're walking through the world as.
Thank you. Lesia.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this discussion. I realized that, you know, I've lived so many places. You know, I grew up in Trinidad. I lived in South Africa, Beijing, Paris. And I think one time when I was living in Beijing, I really craved for this concept of home. But I think as I've lived so many places, I no longer seek home. I think home is where I am. And I'm okay with being hybrid. I'm okay with being foreign, because I really like to get lost in another world and become something new in that world. I no longer seek home to define me. I'm always seeking something newness to like shake me and open my eyes. When I moved to South Africa in my 20s, South Africa was the first place that felt truly like home. And I think it's because like I changed so radically. I learned how to love myself. I learned how to dance. I got rhythm in South Africa. You know, I learned like the beauty of authentic friendships, you know, and it shaped me so radically that like I still say very South African things, having not lived here many years ago. I still eat the food. I still listen to Amapiano, you know? And I think South Africa is so much part of my home because it really taught me how to love and to accept and to change. And so home for me is just being hybrid, being lost, and being okay with that.
Powerful and liberating. Did we have one more question?
It's not a question. Okay. I was gonna answer the question because what you're saying, like when you asked the question, the first thing I thought about is home is in my body. That's why I'm a homebody. But then I thought it sounded corny, but I still said it.
Bars.
But yeah, I feel like it kind of goes to what you're saying, because before I didn't know that, and that's why I would feel lost but not able to come back. But now that I have been able to make myself a home, I can get lost in a way that feels a lot more freeing. So that has been amazing. Like everybody here, I'm sure, you know, we've had a lot of different travels or experiences throughout the world. And myself being Rwandan, I grew up with just, I've been twice, but never speak the language. I grew up with so much shame of the country because of when I could understand what happened in the history, I was just so ashamed of what we did to each other. So I could never feel like that was a home. But now for the first time in my life, I feel like, wait, that's a home. Like I can make that place a home, or it's a part of me, because no matter where I was, people were always able to find out that I was Rwandan. Like I could be walking down the street and I'm like, I'm trying to hide from this place, but I wear it on myself. So long way to say, I don't know. Home is great. Or I've made a great home, so I'm really grateful.
Beautiful. All right. This was amazing. I don't know. Did anyone else want to share? I want to open the space, hold the space for you about home.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also want to talk about home. Originally, I'm from Kenya, but I learned German in Kenya, and I taught German in Kenya. And then I went to live in Germany. Such at some point in Germany, I felt I was at home because I could speak the language and I could do stuff which makes me feel at home, but it was a foreign country. But then I came to the US. Initially, I didn't feel at home, even though I spoke English. I couldn't really relate to the Black culture. But when I met other Kenyans who were here and who could speak Swahili, I kind of felt at home. So for me, kind of to some extent, I feel the language kind of connects me to the home. And yep, I wanted to say that. And hopefully we can make some people learn more Swahili and I can feel at home.
Agenda. There's an agenda.
Thank you all. As part of that agenda, Kevin is the president of the Swahili Cultural Institute in New York, and I'm the treasurer. But you know, to the points that have been raised, I think, you know, there's a multiplicity of answers, and you know, everyone is trying to kind of like locate home. I'll talk about when I located home, but before I do that, there's a comment she made that made me relate to a friend of mine, African-American lady. I'm a lawyer by profession and also, you know, Harvard alumnus. So we were in the same law firm, and she spoke about always going to South Africa every year for about 2 months, where she found home, you know, where home, you know, that was home for her. When did I locate home? I have written a poem about home in a book, self-published, called Orison of Belonging. And that was me trying to find home. Now, the book is mainly kind of like metaphysical and ethereal in its approach. So it doesn't really talk about physical, you know, places and the like. But there's a poem called Africa's Africa, where I try and locate home there. And then about a month ago, I also wrote a song. I'm not a singer. The melody is in my mind, so we don't know if it's going to be a song, but it's called Home Sweet Home. And the only reason why I wrote it was I didn't have a book on the flight and I had time on my hands. But when did I locate home? I located home when I was in the UK for studies and in this wonderful institution. I'm walking in the town square, second day, I believe, Saturday, all sunny. And, you know, it's just a sea of British people, English people, and everybody having a great time. I was one of the few Black people. And there's a Swahili saying that goes, Jogoa mjini, hawiki, Jogoa mashambani, hawiki mjini, which means the rooster from the country doesn't crow in town. Essentially, I'd like to think of myself as fairly confident, but my confidence was shaken somewhat when I was away from home, so to speak. And then it hit me that actually this place in Kenya that I've only lived my entire life for about 3 months, my rural home, because I grew up in the city, and you know, in Africa, a lot of parts of Africa, when you're asked where you're from, it's a bit of a loaded question. Where did you grow up? I grew up in the city, but the answer is where I probably have never lived really, which is my rural home where my ancestry is from. And it made sense when I realized that people from this rural home that I'm from, people who've never heard my name, if I was to pass away here, people who've never heard my name, people I might have spited in a way or looked down upon, are gonna put their funds together and they're gonna rally everything they can, because there's this cultural feeling that this is one of ours. Our ancestors will not be at peace unless it's brought back home. So that's when it kind of resonated, because it's kind of true. It's almost akin to when, if you've watched the movie Amistad, anyone watch that movie? There's that conversation between John Quincy Adams, who's the attorney of Sink, the slave, who, you know, it's the day before his final submissions, and John Quincy Adams is having a conversation and telling him, you know what, I'll pray to God, and you know, I'll look at our constitution, and I'll do my best. And Sink tells him, don't worry, I'll be reaching out to my ancestors, and they have to come to my rescue. Why? because at this very moment, I am the very reason that they existed at all. So it was something to that effect. And when Adams goes to before the Supreme Court, he too reaches to his forefathers, quote unquote, you know, the founding fathers, George Washington, his father, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and the like.
Thank you so much. Did Hannah, you? I think there's someone in the back with a mic, but I just in the interest of time, I think we'll just, I think you wanted to say something right here, and then we can close out. I think also part of my motivation for holding this is Vanessa in the book writes that home is a safe space. So I think whenever we are gathered, we should create the safe spaces that we can. So.
I don't really like speaking, but I feel like I'm obsessed with everybody here, even like people that haven't spoken, because we're like exploring where. And I guess I'm thinking about, I've spent like the first half of my 20s running away from the only place that I see home, which is South London. Not London, not UK, like South London. It's like the only place that understands my certain type of, let's say, English patois, like my South London vernacular. It's the only place that really understands me and where I feel like I understand. But yeah, I've been running away from it. And I've lived in different places in the first half of my 20s, just kind of like not searching for home, because I know where home is and I call home the ends, which my friend is laughing at me. Like, that's what we call it where we're from, ends. And yeah, like I haven't found a stay anywhere yet when we're talking about visas and passports and stuff like that. But this whole idea of like running away from the only place you call home and being pulled to somewhere, especially like from the UK, like I've my home is somewhere that I live under, below a relative poverty line, where it's been so violent to me in certain ways, but I don't have like these stories in different places where like I can cite like a war or a certain like things like, you know, where there's like a mass migration and movement from it. But yeah, that's to answer the question about him. Yeah. For me.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories, Vanessa. Thank you so much. I think this book for me, I read it and I was like, this is my life. And so many of you, I'm sure, from sharing these stories, a lot of what Vanessa's experience is, whether it is coming from Bahamas or Jamaica or coming from South London, there's something about this search for home that will resonate in this book. And thank you so much for, you know, sharing this time with us. And Vanessa, are you going to sign any books or? Okay, great. And thank you to Miatta Kawinzi and to Hannah Giorgis. And thank you all for being here with us.